Hello and welcome to this video. This is about my first 40K army and really my first experiences within the Warhammer hobby. Um, but in many ways it's a tale of three armies, as you will hear throughout the video. Um, I made a video about my first fantasy army, I guess a few months ago now, and I figured it's about time to turn that around and do one about my first 40K army as well. Especially since, as I think, with the launch of 8th edition in the next couple weeks, um, I'll probably be doing a little bit more 40K um, content and both in play and hobby as well. I fully intend to do a lot of Age of Sigmar and continue doing so. But, I'm really pretty excited by the proposed changes and changes in not just the gameplay, but in the story and narrative as well, which I think is pretty fascinating for me. So my first 40K army was, like so many other people, Space Marines. Um, I imagine some people are a little bit annoyed already, and some other people are uh, more positive. As the most popular army in 40K, there's obviously a lot of people that love Space Marines, but it's very much a love-hate relationship. You either love them or you just absolutely hate them and what they kind of represent. But for me, third edition 40K was launched in 1998, and it must have been shortly thereafter, after launch, because I know that there were notable players who were still bemoaning the changes in rules between second and third, that I really started playing around that time. I'm not really sure the exact date, but it was before 2000, but obviously after 1998 when third edition was launched. In fact, I have reason to believe that the first game I ever really witnessed was actually from the edition beforehand. And I think that's the case. I didn't know anything about the game, but just because of the much smaller model count, it was only like a half a dozen models versus each other. So that makes me think it was from the version before third. So, unlike a lot of players that maybe, well, I guess it's not too unusual to pick up a number of boxes before you maybe start gaming in earnest. But I think a lot of people will probably start with a starter box or they play with a friend at home or something. I built a 2,000 point Blood Angels army before my first game. So Blood Angels are technically the first army I ever played. And I guess, it's not that big of a feat because the armies are a bit smaller than they are today in model count, but still a fairly sizable investment for someone that didn't even know if he, would enjoy the game. Which I guess means, in some respects, I've always liked the concept and the lore in some ways more than the actual gaming. The fact that the gaming is enjoyable and amazing unto itself is really just an added bonus for me. But that first Blood Angels army had a lot of Assault Marines. That's like, I was reading about the Blood Angels. I liked the idea of the Assault Marines. The art was cool, and the Space Marine Codex. And that's what they were supposed to do. So my first army was an army based upon fluff. I had no clue if it would be good or not, but that's what I based it on. And so I bought a lot of old, the old packs of models. These are kind of half metal, half plastic, and you could. So I bought a bunch of the jump packs and just put them on regular Marines, basically. And I bought a bow, a, a Predator tank as well, and I had a bunch of other things that were just purely related to Blood Angels, and I thought they were the coolest thing in the world. This was very much at the time of Hero Hammer. Blood Angel librarians were particularly brutal with master crafted a, a clause insofar as they could reroll to wound, and they had a particular power that increased the base number of attacks. So you could get about 9 attacks with Master Crafted, which allowed rerolls, and then the Lightning Claws allowed the reroll to wound, which made them extremely effective. Why did I collect Blood Angels? I don't really know. I mean, apart from just thinking that they were really cool, and the fact that they are one of the more iconic Space Marine chapters that you encounter as a newer player. I remember gluing together my first model and thinking it was amazing. The idea of building these things, I'm sure if I could see it today, it was probably not assembled, you know, very well. I'm sure it was probably a bit sloppy. But I showed my older brothers who were practicing with their band the model I put together, and I'm not sure they had the same impression. I think they're like, "Oh yeah, that's cool," and they went back to what they're doing. But I was completely enthralled by it. I remember reading the Space Marine Codex for the first time, like being in the car after buying it and driving home, and just reading through it with almost a sense of reverence. I got into the 40k lore very quickly. I love the dark art. Um, and I love the grim dark. That love, I think, of that lore for me should never be underestimated because it's the primary reason why I continue to really be involved in this hobby and not other aspects of the hobby. I love the fluff, the stories, the atmosphere, probably more than I do gaming. But you know, getting that first codex, reading the stories, seeing that art for the first time, learning about what a Space Marine really is, um, I just thought that was the most interesting thing in the world and one of the coolest hobbies that I could possibly get in. So, how long did I play Blood Angels? It wasn't that long. My local meta, the local gaming groups, um, were all Space Marines. Okay. I think there were one or two non-Space Marine players. I know someone had played Orcs. I don't think I ever played them. And one of my regular gaming opponents did also play Eldar. Um, but he was also really more of a Space Marine fan as well. And when you play Space Marine versus Space Marine, that really has a significant impact on how the armies are designed and played. Obviously, the success of your armies largely depend on the amount of AP3 weapons. So, lots of plasma and las cannons were common. Um, Not so much with regard to bolters and assault cannons, because those aren't necessarily as effective against Space Marines. And because we're not playing against non-Space Marine armies, everyone was just trying to cram in as many AP3 weapons as they possibly can. Now, I started playing back in Canada, my home province of Prince Edward Island. And it's not a huge province, right? Maybe, yeah, it's pretty darn small. So the local community was also really, really small. And I knew a number of people there that played, and they have a pretty significant impact on, I guess, my development as a newer player. I met this one older guy um, who had this massive collection going back to like the mid 80s or something. I was absolutely thrilled to actually look through his collection. It's probably why I started to develop a substantial collection as well over the years. I always kind of wonder what happened to him. But I actually, we played a game at home. I remember, I think my parents probably thought I was really weird and something was up because he was a lot older than me. And I was pretty young at the time. And it was, here we are trying to play this game with these models, aka toys, kind of on the table. And I'm sure they're kind of wondering what he was doing but he was probably about my age now, so who knows? Anyway, I switched very quickly from Blood Angels. I can't really remember the time frame because I played Blood Angels probably only a few times before I just switched over to generic Space Marines. Probably within about a year of starting playing 40k. Um, Unsurprising to many of my viewers, my Blood Angels army was completely unpainted. So transition to a different Marine army was fairly quick and easy. Um, I think I played a few different players, few different chapters. I think I played Dark Angels or something once in a while, but mostly I focus on the generic Space Marine rules. Um, until about 2001, when the Black Templar were released with the Armageddon Codex and the Armageddon campaign. Something that I constantly refer to because it was, for me, one of the most instrumental parts of my hobby and a fairly interesting time for me. I love the historical inspiration of the Black Templars and the amazing models like the Emperor's Champion and their rules based upon their story and fluff. The Black Templar were also depicted on the box art for the third edition game. So they had kind of like that iconic look to them. I actually have a large cardboard stand up of a Black Templar from that box set on my wall. It's one of the very rare collectible items that I have that probably almost no one else in the world really has. And it obviously has a great amount of uh, value to me as a gamer. So I still own components of both armies, both the Blood Angel bits and parts and the Black Templar as well. A bunch of our iconic characters. I kept all the weapon parts because at the time, again, you had to buy those individually, and they were probably the most expensive part of the army. So I still have all of those, and I hope to reuse those in a Blood Angels and Black Templar army in the coming years. I took the Black Templar to the 2001 Grand Tournament. Again, I feel like I constantly reference that event, but I was still quite young at the time, and I have this funny memory of my mom helping me to flock the bases of those Black Templar, and of course they were painted Goblin Green. And I rushed the army to have it ready, painted the whole thing up. My first painted army. And as I recall, with regard to flocking the bases, she compared it to shake and bake, like when you're, a, a cooking a, a pork chop or some meat, which I think is kind of funny in hindsight. But I finished the army. It was my first painted army, and because I rushed it, and because it's my first army, it was pretty terrible. Um, I'm really too much of a perfectionist when painting. And when you paint your first models or army, they are rarely very inspiring. Needless to say, they were fairly terrible. And I even tried to freehand a, a Templar icon on the models themselves, and naturally that was pretty messy. So those first Space Marine armies were a transitional period in my hobby. It's because I learned to play with them, I learned to win a lot of games with them, but I also kind of felt like on the hobby side I completely failed. So wasn't soon thereafter that I traded the Black Templar army, or most of the models. As I said, I kept a few components for a a um a, a guitar. Now, the hobby store owner actually owned the local music store too, so that's kind of how that happened. I was able to trade the models and use the store credit to purchase this instrument. Um, I'm not one to pursue half measures, so naturally it was a rather beautiful guitar, but I never really played it. I think I strummed a couple chords and then eventually sold it back to the store. Um, and it's ironic that I sold my first 40K army and traded away my first army for Warhammer Fantasy as well. In both cases, I have regretted the decision, and that although I did get back my Beastmen in the case of Fantasy, I often think about the fate of those Space Marine models. Again, they're pretty painted terribly, so I'm not really sure who would have purchased them and really enjoyed them. I mean, obviously, there's some virtue for some players on purchasing painted armies or having models painted for them. But I often wonder if they're still out there or if they've been repainted or whatnot. Even if they are still on a, a Prince Edward Island, for that matter. Perhaps one day I'll be able to track them down and kind of get them back. Regardless, it might now be apparent that I have a tendency to kind of hoard armies. And that's definitely kind of the reason why. Every model in my collection has a story and some degree of emotional attachment. Like I know every single model in my collection. I know exactly what they are, in to some extent, when I got them and how I bought them. And my collection is fairly substantial, so that's I suspect that's the same with a lot of people that collect a lot of armies. But for me, it's one of the reasons why I don't eBay a lot of things or resell a lot of things. To me, they're just like a part of my story as being part of this hobby. The last year or so, I have sold a few things that I've bought maybe as part of a box set, things that don't have a significant place in the collection. If I happen to have bought someone's used collection and it has, for example, a special character that I already have, I might resell that. And if I have um, uh, too many of a particular model or something like that, I think for skeletons, I have like 354 skeletons or something. So like there's room to kind of get rid of some things, but so as long as it's been painted and has a place in my collection, I don't generally contemplate eBaying it or putting it on for sale. And a lot of that comes from those early experiences where I've really regretted selling. Some people get an army, they play it for a year, and then they sell it and buy a new one. That seems to be fairly common for some gamers, and I'm just not in that crowd. So, shortly after selling the guitar, the Tower were released. So, the Tower released in 2003. Played 2001 with the Black Templar. So there's like a little gap there. It's probably about a year where I sold the Templar and was really contemplating whether or not I would be back in and out of the hobby. I didn't know my Beastmen or anything like that at that point. So this was a period where I could have maybe dropped the hobby altogether. But I think I don't think that would ever really cross my mind. I think it was always my intention to reinvest the money in something. And the Tower released this brand new, completely different army for 40K. And I immediately jumped back into 40K. And I don't think, I was probably definitely the first player in my area to ever play Tau. And I continued to play Tau for a number of years. Probably my most active uh, gaming period. I still love Space Marines. I don't have any dislike for them, but I haven't really played significantly with them since. I love the new play style of the Tau as a newly released army. I went from, obviously for the Black Templar, a pure close combat army, to an army that was largely focused on range. And there was also something refreshing to play with an army no one had previously encountered. I played several tournaments with the Tau, and I did fairly well. And I think my next transitional period after that would probably be heavily into Tyranids, um, and then other armies from there out. But I really hope that in the coming years, the Blood Angels, the Black Templar can be revived, in part based upon the models that I still have from those armies. Um, Repaint them. A couple of them I had painted and then I had them stripped, so I'd love to repaint those and kind of get them finished again. Those would be components from like my first army, which I just think would be really fascinating to have again, after being in this hobby for 2 decades. And I would love to. The Tau army is complete, it's painted, it needs some work. I had a hard time deciding what weapons to put the um, on the actual units, and so they're kind of like all over the place. Like I put them on, then I took them off and put them back on. This was long before anyone had the idea of using like a magnet, so they're glued on and then ripped off and glued on again. So they're a bit messed up, but nothing that a little bit of cleaning with a knife and a brand new. They really need to be repainted and kind of re-given a brand new life in the modern 40K. But I would love to see that, and I hope that all three armies do eventually get that time and dedication necessary to kind of give them a new life. In either case, thanks for listening, and have a good one.